Okay, let's see. Test this and make sure that it is working. Make sure that the volume is on. Looks like it is. All right. So close that out. All right, today we need to talk about products, and you're going to have a critical thinking challenge on Thursday. So the class will not meet. You will have class time to work on the critical thinking challenge in your groups, and it will deal with products and AI and using AI to judge whether or not AI is ethical. The products that it is developing are ethical. So, and I will put a prompt out there with a Dropbox for you to submit your stuff in the group. So you will not meet on Thursday. We'll have that for you to work in your groups, and you will then develop a response to the prompt and submit it in your Dropboxes. So it will deal with products and product development and AI specifically. But before we get to that, we need to sort of think about products historically in a historic perspective. So a product that your text talked about a number of editions ago that I have kept because I think it's a better description of some of the issues that we face with regard to ethics in products is a case called DES, which stands for diethylstilbestrol. What diethylstilbestrol did was it was a drug that was marketed by pharmaceutical companies to increase the likelihood for some women who had a hard time carrying pregnancies to term to allow them to carry these pregnancies to term. So there are a number of issues that you can have with regard to fertility problems. So, and we have come up with medical solutions to lots of these problems. Some women have a hard time or are incapable of becoming pregnant. That is not what diethylstilbestrol solved. That issue has been solved through in vitro fertilization, which is controversial in this country and in other countries as well that have high degrees of religiosity. But DES, the one that I'm going to talk about, allowed women who could become pregnant to carry their pregnancies to term. So a subset of the population that has fertility problems doesn't necessarily have a hard time becoming pregnant. They can get pregnant, but their bodies won't sustain the pregnancy. They will miscarry frequently. And that's what DES solved. So diethylstilbestrol was brought to market, and what it did for these women that took it in statistically significant numbers was it allowed them to carry their pregnancies to term and actually have a child. For most people, this is something that they want. Most people want to have children. Not me, but most people. My wife said she didn't want to have kids either, and then we got a divorce and she had 5. So apparently she just didn't want to have them with me. This is for a lot of people is traumatic. And this drug allowed these people who were having, and this is from what I've read on this case study, for many women, not being able to carry a pregnancy to term, and having had a sister-in-law who had some of this kind of issues and miscarried a number of times, this is a traumatic experience for people. And this drug seemed to be a miracle drug in that it allowed these people to have and fulfill their dreams of having children. When the drug is brought to market in the contemporary era, and I believe this was in the 1970s, it goes through extensive trials through the FDA. Before the 20th century and before the advent of the Food and Drug Administration, people brought all kinds of things to market and called them miracle drugs. And maybe they were and maybe they weren't. They did a lot of experimentation without a lot of oversight before the 20th century and even into parts of the 20th century. And then we recognize as a nation with the rise of the administrative state that maybe we shouldn't do that. Cher, who most of you have no idea, so I like music. I talk a lot about music, but it seems like I can tell as I get older, like I'm less relevant to you all than I was when I was 22 when I first started teaching. And I would make these references to musicians, and my students all had the same frame of reference. And so now I make these references. I was talking the other day in my marketing, one of my principal's classes, about the Grateful Dead. And I had a friend who was a Deadhead who followed the, and everybody had these blank stares. And I'm like, you all have heard of the Grateful Dead? No, I hadn't heard of the Grateful. Hadn't heard of Jerry Garcia. But Cher, have you all heard of Cher? You have never heard of Cher? Seriously.
Seriously.
You seriously don't know who Cher is?
Okay, so there.
Believe? Have you heard that song? I mean, do you listen to music?
Yeah.
Okay. Cher is the only recording artist in history to have a top, like a Billboard top 100 song in her teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So she was kind of a big deal. One of her early songs that she sang in her 20s was a song called Gypsies, Tramps, and Thieves. And part of the lyrics involve her father. She's comes from a family of a traveling show, and her father would sell bottles of Dr. Good. That's part of the line. So people marketed all these kinds of things in the past without oversight of the FDA. We then start recognizing that maybe we need to regulate this. There are a number of things that led to the rise of the administrative state. According to political scientists, one of the things that led to the rise of the administrative state was advances in technology. And so we used to just sort of say, well, you could market anything out there and let the buyer beware. Was the theory. And we started recognizing that this is in a more technologically sophisticated world, that this is not going to work. And one of the things that is not going to work are things like drugs. We can't just let people sell bottles of Dr. Feelgood out of their traveling show wagon, because it could be dangerous and it could kill you, and that would be bad. And so we have this agency that comes into existence called the FDA, and they regulate drugs. So in order to bring a drug to market now, you can't just put together these compounds and sort of throw it out there on the public. You sort of still can. There are all kinds of things that are not medicine, and as a result, they have to tell you they're not medicine, right? So they say things like, this is not intended to treat, cure, or prevent any illness or disease in the advertising of these products. That was not the case with diethylstilbestrol. They said that this, is statistically significant in that it stops the shedding of the uterine wall when a woman becomes pregnant and allows her to carry these pregnancies to term, which was good for these families that wanted to have children. But about 20 years after they started marketing this, the first of these children who were females, it only occurred in the female children population, began to develop rare forms of cancer. And so, who did they sue? The drug manufacturer, right? Now, the reason I think that this case is really interesting, so when we organize marketing, what sets it apart as a discipline is that we organize it around the 4 Ps: product, price, place, and promotion. And we'll talk about product today. And then you all will do your critical thinking challenge on Thursday on product development, and we're going to use AI. But I think this case of diethylstilbestrol is one that highlights some of the challenges. And one of the reasons I chose it as a critical thinking challenge was AI, is because it's less obvious that it has a lot of ethical challenges to it, which makes it more interesting. But DES highlights some of the problems that we have with this. So these women who were the product of mothers who ingested diethylstilbestrol developed strange forms of cancer. And they trace it back to DES. And using mathematical formulas, they prove, not beyond a reasonable doubt, because that's the standard that we use in criminal law, right? Beyond a reasonable doubt, but based on a preponderance of the evidence, that these drug manufacturers are responsible for their cancers. They're responsible for them getting these cancer. Now, why is this ethically interesting? They sue the drug manufacturers, and they are successful in this. They're successful in their claims against these drug manufacturers based on a preponderance of the evidence. Now, what is generally the standard that is given as instructions to juries with regard to a preponderance of the evidence standard? Well, if we think about the symbol of justice, it is the Greek goddess Thetis, who holds a scale in one hand, the sword of justice in another, and she's blindfolded because justice is blind, in that when you go to court, you're not supposed to be judged on the fact that you're a male or a female or a member of a certain group. It should be based on the evidence that you present in these scales. And if the scales, the preponderance of the evidence is highlighted by these analytical balances, most people call them scales, but the technical term is an analytical balance. And if the scales tip one way or another, that determines the outcome. So when you get jury instructions, they'll say the preponderance of the evidence is, more likely than not. It is 50% plus a feather. because that's what we consider to be a majority. If you think about this in politics, if you have a requirement that a candidate receive a majority of the vote, which in general elections, we generally don't, because we don't do second rounds of general elections in this country, which means that presidents are oftentimes elected with not a majority of the vote. In 1992, Bill Clinton was elected with what we call a plurality of the vote. It means he got more of the vote than anybody else, but not a majority. So what's the largest plurality you can have? Well, it's in voting, it's 50% plus one vote. That's not 51%.
I think like,
If you have millions of votes out there, if you have 50% plus one vote, it could be 50.00000009, right? And that would be a majority. So based on a preponderance of the evidence, which is 50% plus a feather on the analytical balance, they determined that these women were suffering from cancer based on their mothers having ingested diethylstilbestrol prior to their pregnancies. And at the time that they developed the drugs, we didn't know as much about what crosses the placenta and what doesn't. We now know an enormous amount of things that affect pregnancy, and we put warnings on them. I don't know why there are warnings in the men's bathrooms of bars that say if you drink alcohol, it may harm your unborn baby. They put these warnings in the bathrooms, in the men's restrooms of bars. I cannot carry a baby. That's not going to be a problem for me. Yes.
It's like cigarettes. Like in my country, when you buy a cigarette, like in the cardboard, appears like a disease. Like for example, if you smoke, you will get like a tumor or something, like a cancer.
Yeah.
yeah, they have pictures as in Europe and stuff. They have pictures of people like falling over and
Yeah.
having heart attacks and stuff
Right.
on the box.
Yeah. Right. We warn people. And we tell you that if you, it's one of the warnings on the cigarettes now that say, if you smoke, it can affect your unborn baby. We know a lot more about what affects, so any drug that you ingest during pregnancy, whether it's legal or not, has the potential to impact the health of the child. We know that now. It's one of the reasons that we put warnings on alcohol, right? There's something called fetal alcohol syndrome. So these offspring of these women who took diethylstilbestrol developed these rare forms of cancer, and statistically speaking, they can trace this back to the fact that their mothers took diethylstilbestrol. Now, why is this such an interesting case? Well, I think instantly, one of the things that happens when we think about ethics and when we talk about cases like diethylstilbestrol, and we use the word cancer, that is a scary word to most of us. I've had family members that have died of cancer. It's not a pretty way to go, for the most part. And so it's frightening, and we all have a reaction to this, and we say, well, that's horrible. These women are suffering from these rare forms of cancer as a result of something their mother took, and so we should hold the drug companies liable for that. What's the alternative, though? What was the alternative? Not to be pregnant. That's exactly it. The alternative is that what you're saying is you, drug manufacturer, are liable. Again, I washed the ducks. You are liable for these harms that these women are suffering. But the alternative was they wouldn't have been born. That's what you're saying. That's what the court is saying. When they award judgments to these people, they're saying, you should never have been born. Most people want to live, right? Some amount of life is better than no life, isn't it? Most people, I mean, what you're saying from an ethical standpoint is they should never have been born. Most people want to live. Most people would say, you know, like, even if, and these cancers occurred, as I recall from the case study, in their late 20s. That's a long time to live. And in that time period, there had to have been, generally speaking, people who would go to this length and take drugs in order to become pregnant probably want those pregnancies. And there had to have been good times in there. And what you're saying is you should never have been born, or I, as the plaintiff, I should never have been born. That's really ethically tricky, isn't it? Because again, most people want to live. Some life is better than no life. And none of us are getting out of this world alive, right? I mean, we will all, at some point in time, cease to exist. Now, they hypothesize that the first person to reach the age of like 150 has already been born. So we're doing a good job of prolonging that existence. But it's probably inevitable that we will all, at some point in time, pass away. Right? In theory, I guess we could find ways of completely regenerating, you know, and sustaining life forever. I doubt that will happen in my lifetime, but in theory, I guess that's theoretically possible. But for the vast majority of people, you know, and throughout the course of human history, everybody dies, and you die of something at some point in time. And so what you're saying in holding these manufacturers responsible for this is, I should never have been born. That's really ethically suspect for a lot of ethicists who believe in the value of human life. So, and then when we look at prescription drug costs, so the other part of things that we'll talk about next week are pricing, the second P. When we think about product safety, again, and we go back to these ideas in marketing theory, we have a number of theories in marketing that have framed the way we engage in marketing. So for the vast majority of marketing history, and we talked about this at the beginning of class when we talked about the integration of ethical theory with marketing theory, for the vast majority of human history, in terms of marketing, we have had what was called the production philosophy. And that can be summed up from the line of a rather old movie that, since you don't know who Cher is, I'm sure you haven't seen this movie called Field of Dreams, starring somebody you probably never heard of until, well, maybe you've heard of like this one because Yellowstone is very popular in these parts. Kevin Costner starred in this movie called Field of Dreams. Have you heard of that movie? Okay. Not Cher, but we know who Kevin is. If you build it, they will come. Through most of human history, we have had a scarcity of products. And so if you built anything, if you had anything that was moderately useful, people would buy it. And we didn't have an enormous amount of regulation because people could sort of evaluate. So in the time of, the gypsies, tramps, and thieves that Cher sings about in her song, I hope you all are going to go out and YouTube Cher and Gypsy, Tramps, and Thieves and listen to this amazing song that's out there after class. The idea was, in this production philosophy, in this production era, so for most of human history, so we go from the beginning of human history till about the early part of the 20th century, to the early part of the 1900s, the 20th century. Why is the 1900s, by the way, the 20th century? Why isn't it the 19th century? Ever thought about this?
Because of BC? I don't know.
Well, that's okay. So the way we date things is historians now use a more modern term. They no longer use BC, which stands for before Christ, or Anno Domini, which, does anybody know what AD stands for? Anno Domini? No. In the year of our Lord. That's what Anno, it's Latin for in the year of our Lord. We went from 1 BC to 1 Anno Domini. They now call it BCE, which is before the Common Era and then the Common Era, right? So there was no year 0 and there was no century 0. So from 1, right, BC, or from 1 CE, which is what they now call it, the Common Era, to 101, actually, that's the first century. Okay. So that's why we have the 1900s or the 20th century. So the beginning of the early 20th century is when we start to change philosophies. And at that point in time, we get the Industrial Revolution and there's all these changes. And that leads to the sales era, right? So just as a read, sales era. And then we have the marketing philosophy, sales era / philosophy, which goes from the early 1900s till about 1930 or so. And then we have the marketing philosophy or era, which goes from about the 1930s, when we start to realize we can study the consumer until, I don't know, roughly, like probably 1990. And then we get what's called the relationship philosophy, which goes from about 1990 to present. During this production era, if you manufactured this drug, the law would have said, okay, right? No big deal. If somebody takes that drug, we're going to rely on the legal doctrine, which also has ethical implications, of caveat emptor. Caveat emptor says, let the buyer beware. And for most of this period of time, this production philosophy or era, people could sort of, if you were gullible enough to be duped by Cher's father, or her theoretical father in the song, well, you know, you might be a candidate for natural deselection. Don't do that. Don't believe the man in the wagon in the traveling show. You know. Because it's not likely that he's got anything that's legitimate, and we could sort of evaluate things for ourselves. Before the 20th century, if you went to college in the late 1800s, for example, how did you get there every day? Well, you walked, or you rode your horse, and you could evaluate the quality of that animal. I grew up on a cattle ranch, so I grew up around horses. I grew up showing horses for people, for my family and for other people. And you can look at the horse and you can sort of tell whether or not the horse, before you buy a horse, you know, it doesn't take a genius to figure this out. If the horse is skin and bones and sway backed and has, you know, white hooves, you may be asking for trouble. If the horse is, you know, you can look at the horse's teeth. If the horse is long in the tooth, that's an old-fashioned saying, long in the tooth, and it happens to humans as well. Why do you get long in the tooth? Why do horses get long in the tooth? As you age, what happens to your gum line? It recedes, right? You get long in the tooth. Horses get, it's a horse that's long in the tooth. You know, it's got some age on it. It's sway back. You know, white hooves. Maybe now, and again, in a contemporary era, we fixed that hoof problem. It's called shoes. Right? We put shoes on the horse to help with that, so that the hooves don't break off and things like that. But you could pick up the horse's feet and look at them, and with a little bit of experience, which you should have if you're riding your horse to college or to, you know, town from the farm, or driving your wagon, you should be able to reasonably assess these kinds of things. It was pretty easy. And the first automobiles, likewise, you were probably able to assess that as well. When Henry Ford produces not the first automobile, but the first mass-produced automobile for a general market that anyone, that the average person could afford. It was called the Model T. You could probably, with a reasonable amount of certainty, kind of assess the quality of that good. Look at it, the tires are not, they seem to be put on okay with lots of bolts, and those bolts are tightened down. Can you reasonably assess the quality of the automobile that you drive today? If you got in a wreck in a Ford Model T, I mean, like, what's one of the things that we want to know about in terms of automobile quality today? Whether or not you're going to survive, because the Model T went, I don't know, maybe 15 miles, 20 miles an hour, tops. If you got in a wreck in that, chances were pretty good you were going to be okay at 15 to 20 miles an hour. We're now traveling you know, out here on I-35, what's the speed limit? 75, 80 in some places. You hit something going 80 and you're gonna have a much different sort of situation than, you know, hitting something at 20 miles an hour. Right? Whole different thing. Can you reasonably assess the quality of that product? Do you have any idea whether or not the thing that you're driving at 80 miles an hour down I-35 or 55 in the parking lots here? Because I see you when you're coming into class late and you're driving 1,000,000 miles an hour. Can you reasonably assess whether or not, you know, that's a safe? Well, no, it's hard. That's really, really hard. And they've gotten safer over time. So for most of human history, the legal philosophy, and it has ethical implications, was caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. If you buy something, you have a duty to investigate. Well, once we start with this technology, it becomes more and more difficult for us to assess whether or not something is harmful for us. And diethylstilbestrol highlights this. Who would have thought at the time that it was developed that most people would understand, like, okay, if I smoke the cigarette, I may develop lung cancer. But in the 1950s and 60s, we didn't understand that would affect an unborn fetus the way we understand that today. If I take Tylenol, can that affect a pregnancy? Well, maybe. You know, anything that you take may have an impact. So it's a reasonably foreseeable. So we move from caveat emptor as a result of the fact that we have this technological revolution that makes it more and more difficult to evaluate things. Sure, some things we can still evaluate. You can evaluate sort of the quality of the bedding that you purchase. Although, did you realize, I mean, one of the things that has happened as a result of California safety standards are like the bedding that we sell, you know, it's got to be more flame resistant. When I was a kid growing up, there was this miracle product that they came up with to manufacture textiles called synthetics. Started with something called polyester. Turns out, what is polyester made out of? And what's plastic made out of?
Crude oil.
It's made out of oil. It's a petroleum product. And it catches fire really easily. And you can go up really, really quickly. And so we now have standards about fire retardant materials in, you know, children's clothing and bedding and all of these things, because it became more and more difficult for us to evaluate the safety. So we move from a theory of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, to a theory of negligence in the law. And again, this has moral import. In the past, we would have said, okay, maybe caveat emptor is ethical because people could evaluate, and you needed to learn how to evaluate and take care of yourself and be responsible for yourself. But let's think about this device. Is this device safe? Well, we know a lot more about what affects brain development, for example. Before I had one of these, I could sit there and read for hours on end. I read tons and tons of books. Now I still read a lot because that's my job, is to read. But during the break, when I was a kid growing up, during Christmas break between semesters and during the summer, I would read tons of books. I haven't read a fiction novel in probably 5 years. Why? This device. And I have an excuse. I'm a marketing professor. Got to understand how this works. What has this device caused for a lot of us? Probably you.
Shortened attention span.
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly right. It has caused, it is an environmental factor for ADD. Absolutely. This device is caused, we can't sit still. I have to, in this class, I have to constantly watch what you're doing and change my inflection and walk around and give you a duck so that I can because we have all become trained to TikTok, to just watching these videos that are seconds long. Why was an ad 30 seconds? Because that's what we used to think we could hold their attention. Now, 30 seconds is a lifetime now, isn't it? As a result of TikTok. And we're off to the, watching the cat and the duck become friends, or I don't know what, whatever it is that you find fascinating on Facebook, and you're swiping left and right, constantly. So we moved from this, when we could evaluate things, to this idea of, well, maybe manufacturers now have a duty to manufacture stuff. When we came out with these clothing that was, like a little kid twirling around near the fireplace and poof, up in smoke because it's highly flammable. Well, maybe we shouldn't do that. So we moved from a theory of let the buyer beware to one of negligence with regard to products. And we started to say, like the law caught up with what was happening out there. And we started to say things like, well, maybe people can't necessarily evaluate everything. We saw a similar movement in terms of forever and ever and ever in the law. The theory was if I own property, I owed you no duty. You owed me a duty to stay the hell off my property. Coming on my property is called trespass. And trespassers at common law, forever and ever were owed no duty. Well, that worked okay. As long as we were all, riding our horses to university or to school or, hitching up the wagon and going to town on Sunday for church, that worked okay. But then we started this Industrial Revolution thing, and people started moving away from the farms and into the cities, and they're having children, and these cities grow up around the industrial centers, which are built around rail lines, because that's the way we started transporting massive amounts of goods during the Industrial Revolution. And well, how did trains work? Well, in the past, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, trains only went one direction. Old engines, they stoked the fire. There was somebody called the fireman on these trains, and their job was to shovel coal into the furnace of the train, and they went one direction. Well, when they got to the end of the track, they didn't just abandon the train. These are expensive items of equipment. They turned them around, and you can still see remnants of this today in San Francisco. They still have these streetcars that are, like a single train car, basically, that run up and down the streets of San Francisco. And when they get to the end of the track, a guy will jump out with a key and they'll turn it around on a turntable. That's how they turn trains around as well in the olden days. They they'd get to the end of the track and they would put them on a turntable and they'd turn around, a roundhouse, and they'd go back the other way. Well, these instruments of commerce were attractive to kids. So we had this theory at the common law called trespassers are owed no duty, because trespassers are dirty dog tortfeasors. But you now have these kids that are living around the railroad tracks because that's where cities built up. And this is an attractive, kids are ingenious at coming up with ways of entertaining themselves. It's less difficult in the modern era because we all have this device that we've become addicted to. We've become so addicted to it that we have physical manifestations of this, which highlights how difficult things are to determine whether or not they're safe. How many of you, I bet everyone in this classroom, I do it all the time, have experienced phantom vibrations. You turn your phone off when you come into this class because you don't want it to go off because that's sort of rude. We've come to believe that that's kind of rude. You shouldn't let it go off when you're in class and stuff like that. So how many of you had, I've had 3 while I'm standing here talking to you. Where I thought, oh, you know, and I got to figure out where my friends are. So the minute I ditch you people, I can go, you know, do something else that's more entertaining than this. So kids are geniuses at coming up with things, and these turntables are, you know, attractive to them. They look like a merry-go-round. They'd get on them and they'd lose a finger because it's made of gears and things like that. And so the law evolved from trespassers are owed no duty to if you bring something on your property and it's an attractive nuisance, this starts what's called the attractive nuisance doctrine, and it's easy to control. And you know, like what could you do? Why is it that when you go to San Francisco and the conductor on the streetcar gets out, he has this key? Well, you can lock this so that it doesn't move, so that these kids are not getting on it and turning it and losing their fingers. And so we went from this trespassers are owed no duty to if you bring these things that are inherently dangerous onto your property and somebody gets hurt, you may be liable for that. And similarly, we went from buyer beware, let the buyer beware, to recognizing that, wow, you know, like if you're a manufacturer, you have a duty to make things safe. Now, how much safety is enough? If we had had similar drops in prices of cars as we have seen in computing technology, if you are holding this device, you are holding more computing power than existed in the world during World War II. More computing power than existed in the world during Vietnam or Korea. Right? Think about that. So we start getting these changes in the law based on these moral principles that maybe people have, if they're going to bring this dangerous thing onto their property, they have a duty to lock it up. Now, what has this led to? Any of you have a swimming pool? No? Nobody has a swimming pool? I don't have a swimming pool. I wish I did. I've always wanted to have a swimming pool. Don't have one. My brother has one at his house. And guess what you have to have around that swimming pool? He lives in Plano, Texas.
Fence.
You have to have a big fence around that pool. Why? Because again, kids are geniuses and pools are attractive. Now, I don't know that they're attractive anymore because you all can't put down the phone. Like you can't use the phone in the pool. There's an interesting phenomenon that I have noticed in recent history. When I was a kid growing up, I was a lifeguard. at the pool, which is where everybody wanted to be. And that was the prime job, to be a lifeguard. Why was that? Well, we didn't have this device, this phone device. The cool kids were all lifeguards. Why? You got to sit on a high chair. You got to whistle. And you had, in the words of Eric Cartman, authority. Right? You got to tell people to get out of the pool and throw them out. Took my niece and nephew a few years back to one of the parks, one of the water parks in Dallas, Six Flags property. Half the rides were closed because they didn't have enough lifeguards. They had plenty of food service workers. Why? The cool kids are all food service workers. Why? If you're a lifeguard, you can't be on your phone. You can't have your phone. But if you're in food service, you can. So, in the past though, pools were attractive, but they're also a hazard to kids who might drown. So you got to put a fence up. Manufacturers have to start manufacturing things with a reasonable amount of safety. Now, I don't know how much safety is enough. So we moved to this theory of negligence, which is if I'm going to manufacture something, I have to manufacture it reasonably safe for the average consumer. What does that mean? Well, when I manufacture this chair, it has to be manufactured safely enough to be used for its ordinary purpose. Now, what is that ordinary purpose? Well, it's sit in. Right? So, it's got to be strong enough to hold people without breaking and without falling over, without the legs snapping off or the back breaking when I rock back in it. So you have to have a duty. So we're going to start imposing duties on manufacturers. We're going to say you have a duty to manufacture something that's reasonably safe. And in order to be held liable, you're going to have to breach that duty, right? So there's going to have to be, these are the elements of product liability under a negligence theory. And it happened again. I just felt the phone. Oh, it's actually going off this time. Wow, it's not a phantom vibration. It's actually ringing. Who the hell calls? Like all the calls I get are now spam likely because anybody who knows me, it's like, why the hell would you call? You text. This isn't really a phone, right? It's like a personal entertainment communication device because we don't actually talk. Nobody actually calls anybody on the phone anymore. We just text. So you have a duty. The manufacturer's got to breach the duty. There has to be an injury, and then you have to have causation, which is two things: cause in fact and legal causation. This is what lawyers call proximate cause. So what is legal causation? Well, actual causation is usually determined by what we call the but-for test. But for the action of the defendant, the plaintiff would not have been injured. But there's a temporal aspect which becomes legal causation, and this is highlighted by a case called Fallsgraf versus the Rhode Island Railroad. Have I ever told you about this case in here before? Have I ever talked about this case in here before? Fallsgraf. So Mrs. Fallsgraf is standing on the platform of the railway station waiting for a train, and she's standing next to some scales that are hanging on a wall. When a man enters the train depot and he's late for his train and he's running across the platform and he jumps onto a moving train and he begins to stumble and fall, at which point one of the pursers for the railroad gives him a little shove onto the train so that he doesn't fall off and get caught on the tracks, and he makes the train. But he's carrying a package of something, and that package contains explosives which drop onto the tracks of the railway station, and they explode. The explosion causes a shock wave to dislodge the scales that are hanging on the wall, and they hit Mrs. Falsgraf in the head. And she's injured. Who does she sue? Well, who has the biggest pockets? The railroad. And she says, but for the action of your employee, this purser who gives this guy a shove, I would not have been injured. And that's true, right? But the courts look at this and they say, yeah, but that's too attenuated. That's not reasonably foreseeable. It's not reasonably foreseeable that someone running to catch a train would stumble and fall and miss it and be pushed by somebody. They would then drop their package, which would have explosives that would cause a reverberation that dislodges these scales. And so we're not going to say that that's okay. Now, if we apply this idea, so this is what we call an elements test. You have to meet every element of the test in order to be found liable. You have to have a duty, right? And we create all kinds of duties now. I have a duty to you to provide you with education that's reasonably suited to you going out and becoming a productive human being. Which is why on Thursday, you'll be doing a critical thinking exercise that's intended to mimic what you might do in the real world, looking at whether or not things can actually be marketed the way they're marketed using, like, is AI ethical, and what are some of the problems? Like, what are some of the problems that are associated with AI? Well, basically, I mean, you can Google this and you're going to use AI to ask, what is unethical about AI? And then you're going to evaluate that response. Because it's a product, it's in product development, we're going to have to analyze whether or not we have potential liabilities, right? So we have a duty, so I have a duty to you to provide you with reasonably targeted, educational exposure to produce a result that is you're going to go out and be a productive citizen. So we have duties. I have to breach the duty, or the manufacturer has to breach the duty. It has to actually, like, if I breach the duty and it causes no injury, you've got no claim, right? And then you have to have cause. The injury has to be as a result of the breach of the duty. And that is both cause in fact and legal causation, which is proximate cause. If you didn't, you could say, for example, in a car wreck case, but for the fact that the defendant, or but for the fact that the plaintiff was born, they never would have been injured. That is, birth is a prerequisite to injury, right? But we're not going to hold, your mother and your doctor liable for your car, for the injury that you sustained in your car wreck. Now, most of my students understand and don't have a lot of problems with this idea, who have gone through this ethics course, and you've learned something about duty, right? We've talked about duty ethics in here. A problem with negligence. But if we apply the negligence standard to diethylstilbestrol, would you get liability?
Not if they weren't aware of it, right? The
You're
company
correct.
themselves.
You would probably not get a negligence finding of liability, because what did they do as a result of things like the FDA? Negligence is reliant upon the reasonable person or the reasonable manufacturer standard. If I go through all of the steps that the FDA says I have to go through to bring my drug to market, I have acted in a reasonably prudent manner, haven't I? Based on the best science of the day. In the 1960s or 50s, I don't remember when it was that they developed diethylstilbestrol. Let's look. Would it have been reasonably foreseeable It was manufactured in 1947. Started being manufactured in 1947. So 1950s. Medical science has changed radically from the 1950s in terms of our understanding of what affects pregnancy. And I don't think you would have gotten, because they took a reasonably prudent standard of care in bringing this stuff to market. So what's going to allow for liability? Well, as a result of the fact that we then start recognizing that, well, things like diethylstilbestrol cause harm or caused harm, and we're not going to be able to hold manufacturers liable under a negligence theory. We're going to get strict products liability. Now, this is the one that business students really don't like. Strict products liability says that even if you take a reasonably prudent amount of care in the manufacturing of your product, you may still be found liable for injuries that that product causes. In 1947, when diethylstilbestrol was brought to market, they didn't know what we know today, again, about what happens to fetal development as a result of exposure to things like diethylstilbestrol. But we're going to hold you liable anyway. Why? What ethical theory justifies strict products liability? Well, it's pure utilitarianism. It's 100% pure utilitarianism, pure teleological ethics. Who's in the better position to pay? The drug manufacturer or the individual that's harmed? It's the drug manufacturer. As a result of this, again, if we had had similar discounts in computing technology, this phone, again, is more computing technology power than existed in the world when I was born, which was during the Vietnam War era. The last year the Vietnam War was going on, it ended in 1973, the year that I was born. This would have been to have this amount of technology would have been millions of dollars. If we'd seen a similar decrease in price drop, you can now get a reasonable, you all have MacBooks in here, I see that. Those are $1,000. They've now released the first MacBook that isn't $1,000. But you can get a Windows box for $500. Pretty cheap. If we'd had similar decreases in price as we've seen in computing power in cars would cost about $100. If we saw the same decrease in price from computing power, if that was how much does the average car cost in the United States now? It's more than that. It's more than $50,000. Why? I mean, I can remember when I was a kid growing up, I wanted a Rolls Royce in the worst way. You wanna know why I wanted a Rolls Royce? Because it cost $100,000. A Rolls Royce was $100,000, and that was just an outrageous amount of money to pay for a car. What does the Cadillac Escalade cost? The average Cadillac Escalade. It's over $100,000 for a Cadillac. Again, there's a movie called, I think, Mrs. Winterborn, where she gets mixed up for somebody else. She gets mistaken, her identity, it's played by Ricky Lake. Her identity gets mistaken for this really rich woman. And she shows up like they think that she is the widow of this wealthy woman's son. And they show up at the hospital to pick her up. And the butler / chauffeur shows up and he's picking her up in a Rolls Royce. And she says, wow, a Rolls Royce, that's like the Cadillac of cars, right? And he's like, no. The Mercedes-Benz is the Cadillac of cars. This is a Rolls Royce. But yeah, a Cadillac is $100,000 now. Cadillac Escalade, $100,000. So why is that? Well, because strict products liability. Things like the case of Willie Searcy. Willie Searcy is riding in his father's Ford F-150 pickup, which what is the F-150 pickup? Anybody know this should come tripping off your tongue as marketers? You should know this. It's the #1 selling pickup truck for 30 years. He's riding in the front seat of his father's Ford F-150 pickup truck. He drops something on the floor. His stepfather tells him to pick it up. As he does, he's putting tension on the cross belt, right? So he's bending forward. At that moment, his father slams into the back of another car. Because there was tension being applied to the cross belt at the time of the impact, he is slammed forward into the windshield of the car, into the windshield of the Ford F-150. He becomes a quadriplegic. And of course, they sue Ford on a theory of strict products liability. The argument is that the tension regulator failed. Why did it fail? Well, it's meant to catch. You all have experienced this, right? You've ridden in a car that has a cross belt, right? Not just a lap belt. No cars. When I was a kid growing up, cars just had lap belts, just like airplanes. Airplane seat belts and commercial airliners are just lap belts, which are really good at cutting you in half if the impact is too great, by the way. That's why you have the cross belt. The tension regulator didn't catch. Why? Because there's a design defect in that tension regulator. If you're applying a steady pressure at the moment of impact, now this is a freak accident. Ford's found liable by a jury that awards the Searcy family millions of dollars. Ford ends up not paying it, by the way. But that's strict products liability. Who's in the better position to pay for the injuries this is miles ahead. Ford has done everything that they can to come up with a safe product. And it just, accidents happen. But who's in the better position to pay? Well, in theory, it's the manufacturer, which is now why a Cadillac Escalade costs $100,000. I'm out of time, so I will put the prompt up for you to work in your groups. If you would make sure to put on whoever submits it to the Dropbox, everybody's name who's in the group, so that I can give them credit for it. You're going to determine whether or not AI is ethical. What are some of the ethical issues with AI, right? One is that it steals all kinds of stuff, by the way. And then analyze what the AI tells you about itself in terms of both utilitarianism, deontological, and then virtue ethics. All right, if you got ducks, see me and I will give you credit for those. And I will see you next Tuesday.
Is the assignment for this weekend or Thursday?
It's for Thursday. I'll have the prompt up today and open the Dropbox.
Okay.
So for you to work in your groups. And you'll have a week to do it. So you'll have from Thursday to Thursday.
Okay.